Who should be poor? How poor? And why? On the one hand, we really don't think about this much. We just kind of assume that poverty is bad and nobody should be poor. And so we develop laws and we develop programs to end poverty. That is the aim of many international development organizations. End poverty in all forms, everywhere. But every once in a while, we hear about someone who is a minimalist, and we wonder.
Let's get straight into it. So, what is minimalism? I'm going to quote the minimalists here. Minimalism is a tool to get rid of life's excesses in favour of focusing on what's important so that you can find happiness, fulfillment and freedom.
Maybe sometimes we might even be a little attracted to the idea. Now Sherry, my wife, and I, we were attracted to the idea about 40 years ago or so. Back then it was called simple living. Anyway, after some exploration, around January of 1978, when Sherry and I took formal vows to be faithful to one another in richer, for poorer, till death do us part, we also made some informal vows to live at the federal poverty level. A vow that we have kept, both the formal and the informal, for over these past 40 years, with 2 years of exception. That's too long of a story here, but anyway, let me just say that that decision was one of the most profound and one of the most meaningful and delightful decisions that we ever made. Profitable, should I say. But should, that's quite a word. Should some be poor? It's one thing to ask who are the poor, how poor, and why. It is quite another to ask the question, who should be poor? Often the word should communicates something of a moral quality. People should not steal. Victims of economic setback should not have to remain without basic necessities. Or perhaps we might say that lazy or irresponsible people should experience the consequences of their irresponsible behavior. But we can also use the word should to discuss more wisdom or strategy kinds of things. You know, with your background and skill, you should become an architect. Or, you know, you should try using your knight in playing chess and create forks. You'd win more. Or perhaps you should try minimalism. In this use of should, it's not a moral effect, but rather a question of wisdom. So I ask the question again, who should be poor? How poor? And why? These are questions that have been asked throughout the entire history of God's people. And they were given special attention during the 13th and 14th centuries, particularly in ongoing discussions associated with the person and then the legacy of Saint Francis of Assisi. In this video lecture, I will give you a little bit of background of the times, and then I'll tell you about Saint Francis of Assisi and his life and teachings, because they end up being the stimulus for all of this debate. And then I will survey the key points of the poverty debate itself as it explored these questions during the century after Francis's death. Then finally, we can look back over the debate and we can see what we will learn regarding our approach to these questions today. Europe was changing as the 13th century began. It was tasting the fruit of what had been called the 12th century Renaissance. Historians describe changes taking place in towns, in monarchies, in law, and more. A new sense of individualism and rational order emerged during this period. The Crusades facilitated safer travel, initiated a flow of goods, and promoted a sense of unified European Christendom. So much for the Crusades. It was the beginning, also, of a new European profit economy, when money became a common medium of exchange. New and more democratic forms of government were being explored, even within the Assisi of Francis's own day. Society was shifting from what had been named feudalism to something more. But during Francis's lifetime, it was not really clear what that something more would be. Perhaps some of the most significant early changes were changes in the church. What has been dubbed the Gregorian Reform served to consolidate power within the ecclesial institutions. Some monastic leaders, such as Bernard of Clairvaux, were among the most powerful persons of their time, and the church was perhaps the largest landowner in Europe. By the 13th century, Europe was permeated also with the presence of monasticism. The voluntary poor, the holy poor, were everywhere. Even while church and monastery were experiencing unprecedented success, the institution of church and monastery, came under a bit of scrutiny. Some began to question whether the church or the monastery was really pursuing the apostolic life initiated by Jesus and the apostles. Lay Christians explored new ways of expressing wholehearted devotion and formed new communities of kindred spirits in order to nourish their devotion together. Groups like the Humiliati and the Poor Men of Lyon, also known as the Waldensians, began to seek a simple life and even to suggest that voluntary poverty might be a distinctive characteristic of authentic Christian living. The questions of who should be poor, how poor, and why were beginning to be asked. Enter Francis of Assisi. Raised in a wealthy, nouveau riche, kind of merchant household, Francis witnessed firsthand what was probably the best and the worst of the coming changes. After a painful experience in local wars, Francis went through a personal crisis, and somewhere in the middle of this crisis, he found himself drawn to local lepers. Francis himself, near the end of his life, describes it this way: "The Lord gave me, Brother Francis, thus to begin doing penance in this way. For when I was in sin, it seemed too bitter for me to see lepers. And the Lord himself led me among them, and I showed mercy to them. And when I left them, what had seemed bitter to me was turned into sweetness of body and soul. And afterward, I delayed a little, and I left the world." Care for lepers and people in need became for Francis an integral part of his and his followers' life. Yet Francis chose not to establish a professional charity, but rather to foster an incarnational brotherhood who, as he put it, rejoice when they live among people considered of little value and looked down upon, among the poor and the powerless, the sick and the lepers, and the beggars by the wayside. Ultimately, Francis gave up his connections to family and town, inheritance and influence, moving outside the city walls to help those in need and to repair church buildings. Yet, he did not ultimately choose the route that people would have expected of him. He did not choose to join a local monastery. For whatever reason, perhaps the Spirit was leading him somewhere, Francis chose the life of a lay penitent. Some became attracted to Francis's new ways. They showed up and began to help. And somewhere around this time, Francis and a few friends heard Jesus' call to ministry given in passages like Matthew 10:16, Matthew 16:24, and Luke 9:3, and found therein the pattern of the Holy Gospel. They traveled from town to town, caring for people, working when they needed food, proclaiming the gospel of Christ. But, unlike the Waldensians, the message of the Franciscans was not a critique of the church, but rather a call to renewed life within the church. And in time, the Franciscan movement became a large and influential order. So large and influential, perhaps, that at the end of his life, Francis resigned his leadership, modeling the radical edge of his ideal by the example of his own life. He couldn't lead this massive institution any longer. He communicated his vision through a few writings: Radical Dependence on God, Imitation of the Poverty and Freedom of Christ, Community Life as a Simple Lay Brotherhood of Mutual Care, The Ephemeral Quality of Earthly Real Wealth in Light of the Incomparable Riches of Christ, Compassion for and Solidarity with the Least. These are the values which characterized Francis's life and teachings. The Franciscan ideal was represented and reinterpreted even within Francis's lifetime. After his death, it became well-nigh obsessive. And while scholars may dispute the centrality of the theme of poverty in Francis's life and teachings, no one doubts that in the century that followed Francis's life, it was marked by controversies discussing the nature of poverty, often involving Franciscan friars. The controversies became extremely complex, and in the midst of it, actually, some of the earliest developments of the field of what we now know as economics were actually developed in this period. They were born. For our sake, I will just simply outline the essence of these debates as they emerged within different segments of medieval society, illustrating how our three questions, who should be poor, how poor, and why, how they were discussed during this period. Part of this controversy took place within the ranks of the Franciscan friars themselves. Some, often called the spirituals, saw the Franciscan ideal as a call to absolute dispossession. No money, no credentials, no possessions, just working, praying, serving, begging if needed, but using only what was absolutely necessary, just as the poor would live. Other Franciscans, however, often called the conventuals, they saw themselves as a missionary order, called to proclaim the gospel in the simplicity of life and clarity of message. Yet these conventuals did not interpret the Franciscan ideal as radical dispossession, but rather as a call to voluntary simplicity with provision for the resources to facilitate a successful mission. Disputes regarding this issue hounded the Franciscans for centuries. Just how poor should we be? Another aspect of the controversies on poverty developed in interactions between two different mendicant orders, the Franciscans on the one hand and the Dominicans on the other hand. The Dominicans were an order of missionaries, kind of like some of the conventual Franciscans. They saw themselves as a vital missionary force. The Dominicans believed in the vow of poverty, but they did so because they saw in voluntary poverty a means of demonstrating the gospel message and a way of freeing their preachers from unnecessary responsibilities administrating lands and possessions and things like that. The Franciscans, on the other hand, They emphasized the value of poverty as a spiritual value, following the poor Christ, abandoning oneself to the provision of God, and things like that. Questions about the nature of Christian perfection kind of joined in this discussion. You must remember that Jesus did say to the rich young ruler, if you wish to be perfect, go and sell. So, that brings the question, why should we be poor? During this time also, there were developed a bunch of lay Christian groups. They formed groups that choose to live a life of relative simplicity, but they're not able to make commitments to total poverty or chastity or things like that. They established what were called confraternities, spiritual clubs that kind of had common values and common practices, and they met together and supported one another. Really nice idea. In time, they were recognized by the church, and even later, they were formally affiliated with the Franciscans, being labeled third orders. These third order Franciscans, along with many lay or even scholars who were not associated with the Franciscan order, they posed in many different ways the idea of who should be poor. Is poverty just a matter that is preserved for people who take vows and are a part of formal religious orders? Are they the only ones who can be poor? Perhaps laity, perhaps just ordinary folks might be able to choose to be poor. And indeed, some of these laity lived more austerely than the Franciscan friars. Some secular scholars criticized the whole idea that voluntary poverty was even meritorious in God's eyes. Who should be poor? Finally, and here's where history really gets complicated, some Franciscan scholars in the century following Francis, who desired to help people, like the merchants, who came to them for pastoral care, began to examine just how money works. And they found that merchants, wealthy merchants mind you, were particularly equipped to advance the good of society. So that while arguing that Franciscan monks who took vows should be simple and should be actually strictly, some of them were actually spirituals, and so felt they should take strict vows, at the same time, they believed that these merchants, these medieval economists, and the value of merchants and princes was great for the development of a common good, for the best of society. And so, again, we ask the questions, who should be poor? How poor? Why? All of these questions came up during this period. I repeat, this is only the briefest sketch of the discussions and sometimes sharp debates that characterized the 13th and the 14th centuries. After a full century, the controversies were never resolved ultimately, and each of the groups, the spirituals, the conventuals, the third orders, the secular scholars, the merchants, the economists, all of them remained. Indeed, their descendants exist to this day. So then, we ask, reflecting on this medieval discussion, who should be poor, how poor, and why? On the one hand, it is obvious that some should definitely not be poor. There are many people who are victims of oppressive systems, natural disasters, or personal dysfunctions that contribute heavily to their suffering from a lack of necessities. There will always be poor in the land. Therefore, I command you to be open-handed toward those of your people who are poor and needy in your land. We read in Deuteronomy 15:11. It is vital that we exercise hospitality, solidarity, love, and wisdom necessary to help these people gain as much freedom as possible. But at the same time, I think some people should be poor. The very solidarity, love and wisdom necessary to help others often comes from an intentional, incarnational identification with that is born voluntarily of sharing life with those who suffer. Our relationship with God may be nourished best through a life freed from concerns about material possessions. More fundamentally, I think that Jesus invites some, just as he did invite the rich young ruler, into a voluntary selling of all and following. Some of us just follow God better when we flee our temptations to avarice, or we find life more fully in poverty. But others rather should be rich. There are some people who are gifted with the ability to sense the needs and the movements of the markets and to help arrange economic circumstances that can best serve the common good. And this often requires the capital necessary to invest. For the sake of society, some should be wealthy. Perhaps, I think, even for personal sanctification as well. Yet, wealth should not be managed such that the biblical values of compassion, justice, and so on are ignored. Indeed, it is the godly wealthy with experience using the tools of the market who I think, and the Franciscan economists think, are best to help us discern what appropriate price, unfair loan practice, wise investment are all about. Not for the sake of personal gain, but rather for the sake of improving the quality of life for all. Which then brings us to the question of how poor? It is clear that all Christians should be just, compassionate, not wasteful of God's creation. We should exhibit these values even if it costs us something of our standard of living. And yet, it is not always clear what actions, to what degree, best expresses these values or other economic values. The complexities of the nature of poverty, along with the unique circumstances of our life, make impossible a precise designation of moral income or expense standards. Yet the ambiguity of determining appropriate action does not remove us from the responsibility for appropriate action. For the wealthy to do nothing, claiming that the issues are too complex, reminds me too much of the irresponsible poor, claiming that they are victims of society and cannot figure out how to improve their lives. I believe some, like Francis himself, should rid themselves of everything and should join the ranks of the poorest of the poor. Some should joyfully abandon themselves to moment by moment abandonment, dependence on God, sharing life with the least, and proclaiming the gospel in their midst. But I also think that the conventual or the moderate Franciscans, they have their point. Can't we be careful about our ownership and our use in an ongoing ministry? Isn't there wisdom in nurturing a simplicity that employs a form of the use within the context of what is appropriate for diverse ministerial circumstances? I think so. Furthermore, I think there are wealthy or middle-class Christians who can employ a measure of voluntary poverty in a way that they restrict their own ownership and use of goods and services for the sake of the kingdom. There are also involuntary poor who should strive to become more wealthy, and others who please God by graciously receiving help from others. As should be clear by now, the possibilities of serving God well with our economic practice are endless. And this is my point. We have for too long approached the questions of who should be poor, how poor, and why with narrow and shallow options. Either make a good living and be generous, or become a nun or a missionary or something like that. There is so much more available. I say this not only out of reflection on Francis, but from my own personal experience and my relationships with many people who are exploring creative forms of life today. We are in desperate need, I think, of fresh experiments with what I call the radical middle, a life between the default American dream and an almost impossible renunciation of marriage, possessions, and such in formal monastic affiliations. But why? Why should some choose to be poor, or at least poorer than we are now? It is clear from what I have written above that there are actually a wide variety of reasons for choosing poverty, or wealth for that matter. Some simply follow a vocation, a form, a call from God. Others confront the weakness of avarice with the strength of poverty. Some use poverty as a way of joining in life and ministry with others. Some use wealth as a way of making the world a better place. Some just find God best in one or another of the circumstances. In conclusion, I simply want to highlight 3 motivations that we have seen to be central to a Franciscan approach to poverty, motivations which seem to me especially relevant today. First, in choosing a measure of voluntary poverty through our own renunciation, we place ourselves more directly into the state of blessed dependence in which we were intended to live from the very beginning of creation, and in which Jesus seeks to rediscover, "Seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you as well." Second, through becoming poor, we enter into the fellowship of solidarity. Solidarity with the poor Christ, with one another as we share needs with the community, and with those who are involuntarily poor. This solidarity of powerlessness actually bears fruit in the exercise of a wisdom and even a power that can be exercised from no other place. Just ask Mother Teresa of Calcutta. And finally, we choose voluntary poverty to model Christ for the world. A life of simplicity has always communicated the message of Christ to others. It frees us up to be generous with time or money. A community of joyful dependency and mutual love demonstrates to the world just what heaven might be like.